Welcome to Talking Feds, a roundtable that brings together prominent former federal officials and special guests for a dynamic discussion of the most important political and legal topics of the day. I'm Harry Littman. Fuck it. Release them all. With those words, newly reinstated President Donald Trump abruptly ended any deliberation over which nonviolent January 6 offenders to pardon and instead unleashed them all on the country, to the disgust and outrage of constituencies from D.C. trial judges to law enforcement officers whom the marauders had battered. It was the most repugnant act in a 5-day-long blitzkrieg during which Trump issued a flurry of executive orders curated from the pages of Project 2025. The sweeping directives were united by themes of self-aggrandizement, vengeance against perceived enemies, the rollback of liberal state landmarks dating back to LBJ and the Great Society, and the smothering of oversight moving forward. And they were reinforced by a wave of internal agency directives, most notably within the Department of Justice, that gutted long-standing practices and purged a hit list of career officials deemed disloyal to the new regime. Trump capped his first week in office, cowing the Senate into narrowly confirming Pete Hegseth to run the Department of Defense, notwithstanding a list of egregious shortcomings, and followed this up after we taped with a coordinated dead-of-night purge of about 17 inspectors general across the run of federal agencies. And, as with many, if not all of his constitutional assaults, it was unclear whether any of the traditional institutional checks, Congress, the courts, the media, or even the American people, had the resolve or capacity to stop him. To assess the damage of a stunning 5-day onslaught against constitutional norms and the rule of law, and consider what it portends about the near, medium, and long terms, we welcome 3 of the nation's most prominent and thoughtful commentators. And they are Susan Glasser, a staff writer at The New Yorker, where she writes the weekly column on life in Washington and hosts the Political Scene podcast. She previously served as editor of several Washington-based publications, including Politico Magazine, Foreign Policy, and the Outlook and National News section for the Washington Post. You remember the Washington Post? It had quite a run for a while. Welcome, Susan Glasser.
Thank you. So great to be with you.
David Jolly represented Florida's 13th district in Congress from 2013 to 2017 and has held virtually every position in Congress, from intern to member. Also has worked outside of Congress as an attorney and political consultant. He's a frequent political and policy analyst for MSNBC and CNN. David, really good to see you.
Good to be with you, Harry.
And Bill Kristol, the editor-at-large at The Bulwark, and is founder and director of Defending Democracy Together. He founded the Weekly Standard in 1995 and edited that influential magazine for over 2 decades and served in senior positions in the Reagan and George H.W. Bush administrations. He's also the host of the excellent podcast, Conversations with Bill Kristol. Always a pleasure to welcome you, Bill. Thanks for being here.
Hi, Harry. Good to be with you.
I feel as if we need to start the episode with a very deep breath and exhale. It was a week unlike any in our constitutional history, and we saw a blitzkrieg from the new president that had no organizing theme other than self-aggrandizement and petty revenge. But I want to start here. This possibly reflects my DOJ bias, but as I wrote on my Substack, the wholesale pardons of the January 6 marauders, to me, stood head and shoulders above the other affronts to the Constitution. So let's begin there. Do the pardons stand out as the signal event of these first few days? And do they encapsulate more than any other move the damage and danger of the new presidency?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to agree with you. Absolutely, Harry. I think that when I look back on the 4 days so far of the second Trump administration, there are 2 things that I suspect, are likely to make it into kind of the history of Trump 2.0, whatever that's going to be. And I'm sure there'll be things that seem significant in hindsight, but I think we already know for sure that Trump's inaugural address is going to be there because it was really different than any inaugural address, I would argue, in our history. And that includes even his first inaugural address. Both of them were dark. This was a reprise of the American Carnage theme. But what Trump added to it this time was a sense of the personalization of power and of the office in a way that is the most, I think, profoundly un-American thing I've ever heard in an inaugural address. And for him, he had danced around this phrase for the last few months, but for him to come out and assert in the inaugural address that I was saved by God to be your leader. This is really a remarkable statement. So my view is that that's something that is very likely to last. And I agree with you. These January 6th pardons, by going in a sweeping direction of virtually everyone who took place and the attack on our own Capitol. And by the way, not just a riot gone haywire, but in the very explicit effort to block the lawful certification of an election and essentially an anti-constitutional attack on the Capitol. This is without precedent. I believe that it is an action that would not have been taken by any president in our history. Again, whatever that person's ideology or political viewpoint, it is a lawless act, I believe, and it is one that will stand.
I agree with the theme, and certainly Susan's words that the decision to pardon the J6 or commute some of the J6 convicts represents a dark chapter, and it represents Donald Trump pardoning people out of his own self-interest rather than in accordance with what traditional execution of the pardon power would be. You're not talking about people, particularly the most egregious ones, who have shown remorse or who have suggested that they have learned from this and asked for mercy. In fact, many of them remain defiant. The most dangerous ones remain defiant. Here's where I'm not sure that it necessarily needs to be recorded as the most egregious act of the first week. There's many to choose from. Here's the reason why. The use of the pardon and commutation authority of Donald Trump was within his constitutional authority. I am likewise concerned, and maybe more concerned, by his willingness to abuse his authority in ways that offend or even violate the Constitution on day one, which would be his violation of the 14th Amendment with his executive order on birthright citizenship, but also his repeated use of the Impoundment Act through executive orders and just through declaration that he's not actually going to honor laws that have been passed and money that's been appropriated and signed into law, that he's just not going to execute the laws of the United States. In those areas, I think what we see from Donald Trump this first week is what he learned from his first 4 years, that he can violate arguably de facto the constitutional requirements, but at least the constitutional expectation and norms of his office. And what he's learned from his first term is the latency of the courts and the latency of the process to catch up with his violations is a period that he can use to enact the MAGA agenda. And frankly, the MAGA constituency is fine with that. They support his violation of the Constitution in many ways if it achieves what he's promised to do. So ending birthright citizenship is an area where, though he doesn't have the constitutional authority, he has the support of his constituency. Violation of the Impoundment Act, which I think we will continue to see repeated, and that may be almost a landmark case 2 years from now that hits the Supreme Court based on some of the actions of the president. In those areas, sure, retelling history about J6, retelling history about the 2020 election, he will do that out of his own toxic blend of kind of vanity and narcissism. But how he intends to use the power of the presidency in violation of the Constitution, I think he just told us that the next 4 years is going to be very damaging to the constitutional order.
It's been such a landslide of actions. I'm not sure everyone even knows about the Impoundment Act. So just in brief, yet Trump has said Congress can pass laws and appropriate money. So we learned in third grade, Congress does that, and then the executive executes, but they're asserting the constitutional authority. In fact, the countermand by Congress, they're asserting is unconstitutional, that he can just ignore executed laws and not spend that money.
Well, here's a practical example, Harry, let's stay with birthright citizenship. He can direct the Social Security Administration to require documentation from both parents before issuing a Social Security number to a newborn child. Suppose he does that. There are other areas where he has said he's not going to spend money, for instance, in the bipartisan infrastructure bill to continue building, or he's not going to spend money on environmental programs. This is exactly what Richard Nixon did that led to the Impoundment Act. Donald Trump has just said, I'm not going to abide by the laws that have been passed.
I mean, it's been such a not just dizzying week, but an important week that there are several candidates for things that may end up being memorable. And I think really several of them, more than 2 or 3, could be. I mean, I think Susan made a very important point about the radical personalization of the presidency and a presidential power by Trump in a way that has been resisted. We've crept up to that a little bit over the years, a little more, in the last 30, 40 years than before, but nothing like this. I think very much, I agree with David, and I'd go further than him. If you look at all the executive orders together, and I'm sure we'll get back to this, they've together the exertion of authority under Article 2, the way in which he's combining certain things. It's an invasion, and also I want the military to be available. And they look sort of haphazard, but they're not. I think this is a pretty carefully constructed jigsaw puzzle. The pieces fit together, and we may not end up quite where we could. The courts may step in, Congress may step in, unlikely, but we could end up 2, 3, 4 years from now. And he'll do further things, of course, that are very far from what anyone thought was a plausible exertion of presidential power in certain key areas. I'd say especially immigration and the operations of the federal government, the internal operations of the federal government. So that's also there. Then there's the pardons, which superficially look, well, that's just kind of backward, looking. But I agree with you. It's a very big deal. And it's a big deal in this way. If he had done what J.D. Vance said Trump was going to do, about 10 days ago, of course, he's not going to pardon the most violent criminals and not even commute those sentences of the seditious conspirators. But, there are a lot of people who were swept up in it, and the violent would be a little different. Vance said that. I think Speaker Mike Johnson said a version of that. I mean, it would have been bad, I think, but it would have been sort of plausibly, okay, that's what he thinks, and, he did it, and we'll move on. He sent a message by insisting on the blanket pardon, and there are 13 commutations of all the seditious conspirators, except for the most powerful one, incidentally, who got a full pardon, right, Enrique Tarra. But he sent the message that violence is fine. Violence committed on my behalf is fine. Violence committed on my behalf has been pardoned and will be pardoned. And so these people are back out. The leaders are there. The groups now have huge legitimacy on the extreme right. They're going to be recruiting people like crazy, the Proud Boys and others. Others will be sort of self-recruiting and self-radicalizing, and they'll feel that Trump has their back, and Trump will have their back, incidentally. And do we doubt? I mean, after this, they'll go storm some anti-Trump think tank or civil rights office or pro-immigrant, shelter somewhere, and the vigilantes will, or they'll attack people who are protesting against some Trump policy. Do we have any confidence that Trump will see that the laws are enforced against them in the first place? Maybe it'll be state laws, but when there are federal laws at stake, do we have any confidence he won't pardon them all? So I think the degree to which, by choosing to go all the way with the blanket pardon, that's a bigger deal than people have appreciated in terms of creating a culture of violence and of vigilantism on his behalf in the United States.
I agree with all of that, and I just want to respond to David why I place this above. You're absolutely right. It's an abuse of the pardon power, but it doesn't have the same kind of constitutional challenge. But the point that Susan made, among many, really stands out to me. So I think the victims of the act are basically all of us and the Constitution. It goes back to the January 6th outrage that we all saw and an attempt to say that's okay. It's not just violence, but it's violence in support of the attempted abnegation of the peaceful transfer of power. And so, in that sense, I found it breathtaking.
Can I give you a remarkable contrast on this week? In the Lake and Riley Act, the legislation that says if you're an undocumented individual picked up even for a nonviolent crime, that you automatically get detained, passed with Democratic support as well this week. There was an amendment to that led by John Cornyn that said if you're an undocumented immigrant who assaults a police officer, you automatically get detained and prepared to be processed for deportation. So in that case, if you're an undocumented immigrant who assaults a police officer, you're detained and deported. That's probably widely supported. But if you're a J6 seditious conspirator who assaults a police officer, Donald Trump's going to either commute your sentence or pardon you and let you back out on the street.
I wanted to talk about Vance. And Bill, it wasn't just Vance and Johnson. It was also Bondi in her confirmation hearings. And those guys weren't out front. Those were the talking points. This is what we're going to do. And I was thinking, who are they going to even find? Because I knew the DOJ did not. They had incredible numbers of people to try to process. They already let nonviolent offenders off. So were they going to find 3 or 4 that they could quibble over? And they're back and forth. And then I think it was reliably reported the day or two after, going, nonviolent. That's the mantra. Nonviolent. Fuck it, release them all. That's Trump at the very. Fuck it, release them all.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to add that, I take the point, and I think it's a very important point that we should be looking particular where Trump is acting wholly outside of the law or, defying the law or acting outside of the Constitution. What strikes me about the January 6th pardons and what to me makes them so lawless is not that the president doesn't have a power to pardon, but that it is in service of the most wildly unconstitutional act fostered by a president of the United States. And that I wouldn't think this way even if he had pardoned another category of violent offenders. But again, for him to have done so in the service of what I believe will be one of the signature stories that does make its way into the history books about this period of time, because there's never been a moment in our history where we had the leader of one of our 2 political parties launch an attack on the seat of our democracy itself. And you know what? You can, accuse me of being hysterical and shrill and like we've talked about it too much, and I'm still going to say the same thing, and I don't care. I'm going to say the same thing over and over again. So again, I think it's really an important point that in general, the filter that we ought to use when we're talking about Trump, especially in terms of superlatives or history, is what is he doing that's really an outlier versus what is he doing that, we might not like or think is extremist, but falls within the spectrum of what another, perhaps a very far right president would do right now.
I mean, just to put a footnote on what Susan said, they acted on behalf of Trump. It wasn't just that they acted against the peaceful transfer of power, which is very important. What does it say what's going to happen 4 years from now? Let's just be concrete. What do people start doing in September of 2028? Maybe it's Trump on the ballot. Maybe it's Don Jr. Maybe it's J.D. Vance.
We've already had an amendment introduced in Congress.
But that's at least an amendment. That's at least like an attempt to pretend to be constitutional.
Yeah, exactly.
Incidentally, if Trump runs for a 3rd term, there's, in my opinion, 0 chance that he will be kept off the ballot. It'll be like the 14th Amendment thing. The courts will say, well, let the people decide. It's complicated because he didn't have consecutive terms. If he wants to run for a 3rd term, he can. But that's not my point. My point is sort of the degree of violence 4 years from now. The threat, I've been a bit of a doubter, and I'll come out, of course, we're going to have elections in 4 years. And we are going to have elections in 4 years. But are we going to have elections not marked and marred by the threat of violence? And are we going to have 4 years of governance in which there are not going to be paramilitary forces and vigilantes on the outside coordinating with some of Trump's people and friendly red state, sheriffs and so forth? This is a 20s, 30s, unfortunately, European situation that really is, we have managed to mostly avoid in the U.S., with the exception, actually, of the South after Reconstruction, Ku Klux Klan a little bit in the 1920s. Things that heretofore have been regarded as shameful parts of American history are now being encouraged by the President of the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that we've had a certain amount of violence, at various other divisive moments in our history, which is actually why I wanted to just mention on David's other point, because I think this is important about a president, an imperial president, who essentially is unilaterally rewriting the balance of power with the other branches of government. And I think that was an underappreciated theme and through line of Trump's 1st term in office, was the absolute flouting of Congress, and with the willing complicity of many, many members of Congress in his own party, including the leadership. But this was, again, something that he already had a pronounced view of. For example, after he cycled through his first 2 secretaries of Homeland Security, for nearly half of his tenure as president the first time, he didn't even bother to send up another nominee to be the Secretary of Homeland Security. I don't think people realize that. And it cycled through a series of actings. And essentially, actually, by the end of his time as president the first time, was going out publicly saying, hey, I like the actings, then they work more directly for me. And that, of course, is almost the definition of the personalization of power. So he's going to go around Congress. The architect of that Impoundment Act theory that, is Russell Vought, who is now back for another term in the Trump administration, also the principal author of the Project 2025 playbook from the Heritage Foundation, which, of course, Donald Trump denied on the campaign trail was going to be the blueprint for his presidency. But in fact, it's already turned out to be the blueprint for his presidency. But the point I just wanted to make, really just a minor amendment to underscore how much I agree with this is what Donald Trump got impeached over in his first impeachment, was seizing essentially hundreds of millions of dollars in military assistance and security assistance funds that Congress had appropriated for Ukraine in defending itself against Russia, and seizing that and refusing to send that to Ukraine until they did him the personal political favor, essentially, of blackmailing Joe Biden. And again, this is something that was considered impeachable and shocking just a few years ago. And here we are essentially on week one of the new term. And I'm not sure people are even thinking at all about the assertions that are embedded in so many of these executive orders.
And I want to make the subsidiary point that we've talked a little bit, well, at least that's legal, at least it's not. But this week takes you to the history books inevitably. And I avoided assiduously any kind of like Nazi analogy just because it seemed to be overly dramatic. But some of them are unavoidable. I think a lot about Hungary more recently. But the main point I want to make is a established model by which democracies decline is the legitimate election of a certain strongman who then initially exploits, maybe even within the realm of how it's been exploited before, but not necessarily the legal levers of power, and then distorts or corrupts them enough so it's just too late to push back. I just want to say I'm totally on the Susan Glasser screw it, I'm going to be shrill, because it is how we see it. And one of the things that I want to talk about later is the opinion of the American people. But just this model of use and abuse first of the legal levers, I think, is actually problematic, not consoling. All right. We mentioned this. Bill mentioned it. The incredibly accommodating GOP response, which I think can be sort of summarized as, bag over the head. Senator Thune said, as to the pardons, we're not looking backwards, we're looking forwards. But you got to imagine they're going to go back to their districts. Everyone, are you in favor of these pardons? 2/3 of the American people seem not to be. How chagrined are they? And do you expect some kind of serious independence to be asserted over this topic, or are they just going to go along?
Go along. We're 8 years into this. Donald Trump owns these people. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in elective office right now, at least at the national level. The Republican Party is the party of Donald Trump and his sycophants, period, full stop, because he already made it a condition of any kind of prominent position to go along with things that were just blatantly untrue. So whatever red lines they were have long been crossed. So if you've crossed along with Donald Trump this far, you're in it. You're in it so that you're craven enough to vote for Pete Hegseth as Defense Secretary. You're craven enough to vote for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as Health and Human Services Secretary, and you're craven enough to vote for Kash Patel as FBI Director. Okay, these are probably the worst and most dangerous nominees in important jobs, probably of our lifetime. And America's had a lot of crappy officials before, so it's not unique to Donald Trump to have bad or unqualified nominees. But even within that,
I think of John Tower a lot, who had one of 3 Hegseth foibles and had to withdraw.
Yeah, and was otherwise qualified for the job.
You put all 3, including Kash Patel. Bill, one of your points was, okay, maybe they go along, but maybe this empowers or somehow makes the likelihood of pushing back against Patel, who really is the worst of the worst, at least for the job he's been recommended. Do you see that much? Do you see a sort of satellite kind of possible cost to Trump?
I mean, it's possible. We'll see. We'll know in a week. I mean, perhaps. Look, Tom Tillis, the senator from North Carolina, who's one of the less obeisants to Trump than your average Republican senator. Tom Tillis from North Carolina, in questioning Pam Bondi, whom you mentioned, the Democrats are going after Bondi, saying, would you rule out recommending pardon for violent convicts from January 6th? And she was ducking. It's hypothetical. I'm not going to answer it. And the Democrats were kind of beating her up a little bit of this. And Tillis intervened and said, these Democratic senators are being totally unjust to you, Ms. Bondi. You're right not to answer this. But anyway, we know it's not going to happen. We know there's not going to be a pardon for the violent demonstrators. He said, and that would be wrong. He said, I would be against that. J.D. Vance has said he's against it. And so he is on record as saying he was against it. And he has criticized Trump a little bit after he did it. Kash Patel is up next week before the same committee. Kash Patel has been a key advocate and promoter of full pardons for all of them. He is at the center of that. He's the organizer of that J6 choir, which are who are violent convicts. That's why they're in the D.C. prison. If they were misdemeanor guys who had just been swept up.
Literal choir, by the way, for people who don't know.
Right, and he was the promoter. He made money off selling that song, their version of the national anthem. Can you believe it? I mean, but literally, if they weren't violent, they would have been farmed out to some less, unpleasant prison probably than D.C. They were here because they were convicted of violent crimes. If you look at their list of people who were there in D.C. And these are Kash Patel's people. He is up for confirmation, not to a random job, but to FBI director next week. Tom Tillis is on that committee. Now, look, I don't think it's out of the question that Tillis will say that's a bridge too far, but that would be a key test for me if he does or doesn't say that. Incidentally, the Republicans are terrible. What about the Democrats? They do have 47 senators, 216 members of the House. They don't have nobody, right? They got 46, 47, 40, 48% of the vote in the presidential election. There's a kid in Kansas, Patrick Schmidt, I know a little bit, who is a state senator. I think he just got elected in Kansas, a Democrat, a military veteran. He introduced a resolution in the Kansas legislature, doesn't mean much, disapproving of what Trump did. And he put it, and David will like this as a former state, and sort of so active in state politics. And he put it in terms of Kansas. We in Kansas, we have the Kansas Capitol Police who guard us. We respect them. We want to express our disapproval of the president pardoning people who assaulted the police who protect our federal counterparts. So it was kind of a cleverly done. But anyway, it's just a resolution. It doesn't have any force, obviously. It's just a sense of the Kansas legislature. It's not going to go anywhere in Kansas, incidentally, I suspect. Has the Democrat even thought of doing, maybe they have and I missed it, but has any Democrat even thought of introducing a resolution? They are allowed, even if they're the minority party, they are allowed to literally introduce, resolutions in the House and the Senate. They are allowed to stand up on the floor and speak about them. They're allowed to cause trouble. They're allowed to try to put pressure on Republicans to say, well, why won't you support this resolution? Are you in favor of it? They could make an issue of it. And I do think it's a rare case. Explaining these executive orders is hard to people, I think. This is a rare case where the public does kind of understand it. The numbers aren't good for Trump. Are the Democrats making this a real political burden for Trump, as they should be, in my opinion? And I think the answer is, so far, I'm pretty dubious. They don't seem to me to be doing that much.
They seem really in disarray and retreat and still figuring out the last election and the like.
I think this will be a political liability for Republicans. It'll show up in TV commercials or on mail. But we have to recognize what we know about Donald Trump is the chaos theory with which he manages suggests that things move so quickly. I mean, we're not talking about TikTok anymore, and that was 5 days ago, another place where he didn't have the statutory authority to suspend it and do what he did. He just did it as a deal maker and said, who's really going to sue me? I think if there are any persuadable voters in today's environment, most voters are indeed tribal. The central issue now is the same that was before the November election, which is the economy. And ultimately, what will hamstring Republicans is if indeed people still have an economic malaise, despite the numbers that are actually pretty good. If they have an economic malaise in the midterms, then Republicans are in real trouble. If for some reason they feel like the economy is back and going in the direction that they want it to go, and it's been accelerated by Trump and Republicans, then unfortunately, very, very darkly, I don't think it matters.
There are like 1 million law enforcement officers in the United States. They have groups. They have associations. There are Democratic members of those associations. There are Democratic members of Congress who are former law enforcement officers. They would be targeting those, but fine, they can't change tens of millions of people's minds. I totally agree with that. Can they get a few people to think, geez, I thought he was kind of on the side of back the cop, back the blue? And could they begin to instill some doubts? Would that be such a hard thing for a political party to do? I don't believe for a second, incidentally, this is going to be in any ads in September of 2026. This will be, if the Democrats don't make it an issue now among the people who might care about this, and there are some, obviously, right? Then it's not going to be an issue 18 months from now magically. And so I'm very pessimistic about, the Democrats seem to have no understanding that you don't have to solve the macro problem of how you convince people, you're a better steward of the economy all at once. You can make a dent in particular constituencies. And this is a very precise constituency. And the police unions did come out against the pardon of the violent offenders. But again, do you have any impression the DNC is putting a couple of $1 million aside to do some targeted mail and digital to local police unions? They're not. I think they're just not thinking that way.
Think about, the American people at the parallel time 4 years ago. There was a huge march and there was a real sense of, man, we have to push back. And there does seem to be, in part, I want to say, or indifference or withdrawal, but I actually think there's a sort of, almost let's watch the show kind of feeling.
For the record, we have to point out, unfortunately, shine a light on this. Bill's right that the National Fraternal Order of Police, other national police unions condemn the pardons, but they also endorsed Donald Trump in November over Kamala Harris. And I think they bear some responsibility for the election of Donald Trump, the man who ultimately pardoned the J6 violent convicts. The Fraternal Order of Police, I say this with heartbreak, many of them are friends of mine. The national organization endorsed and supported Donald Trump's election.
I'm glad that you pointed that out because a couple of thoughts. First of all, Donald Trump is also the first convicted felon ever to, be elected president. And, the incredible sort of built-in hypocrisy of a party that campaigned on a platform of lies about the state of the country and crime in particular. It's one thing to emphasize law and order and crime, but they campaigned on a false picture of the country. The candidate that they endorsed is the candidate who lied about people in Springfield, Illinois, eating the dogs. And I believe that their endorsement of Donald Trump came after that, not before that. And so, yes, you're right that they bear responsibility. But what's the other aspect of Republicans' pushback is one that we haven't talked about, which is what Joe Biden did when he was leaving. And he pardoned 5 members of his family after having previously pardoned his son, Hunter. And he did that on his last day in office, really, literally as his last official act. News of it was just coming out as the swearing-in ceremony was beginning at the U.S. Capitol. These are not equivalent things, pardoning your family, which has been done by presidents before. But, it handed Republicans an issue that they have really successfully taken advantage of. And Harry, you quoted the Axios report about what Donald Trump said when he sort of cut off his aides' debate over how, should we do a blanket pardon of the January 6th people or not? And he said, fuck it, let's just, pardon them all. But what he was complaining about at the moment and what had gotten him very worked up was Biden's pardoning of his family. And that is, if you look at the interview that Trump gave as his first interview this week to the ever reliable Sean Hannity, he's also fulminating about Biden and the pardons. You heard that from a lot of the Republican members of Congress who didn't want to really answer for Trump's pardons. It's the ultimate excuse for the whataboutism folks. And that's in general one of the painful takeaways of the whole last year. This pardon incident is just one example, but throughout the 2024 election year, for every Trump outrage, Republicans would cite, look at the cover up of Joe Biden's health or some other example. And I think that that's part of the hole that Democrats have dug themselves into right now that explains why they are not really at the moment mounting a very effective defense and offense against Donald Trump.
All right, it is now time for a spirited debate brought to you by our sponsor, Total Wine and More. Each episode, you'll be hearing an expert talk about the pros and cons of a particular issue in the world of wine, spirit, and beverages.
Thank you, Harry. In today's spirited debate, we hop into the beer cooler to ask the question, to IPA or not IPA? The India Pale Ale has become synonymous with the word hoppy. And it's that hoppiness that's created a bittersweet relationship with IPAs that has divided beer lovers across the world into two categories. Those who love this style of the pale ale for its full flavored bite with flavors of lemon and pine needle, plus typically higher alcohol content. And then those who prefer a little less sharpness with each sip. So what gives IPAs that signature bite? Well, there's another abbreviation you should know, IBU, which stands for International Bitterness Units. The higher the IBU, the more bitter the beer. Luckily, at Total Wine & More, we carry an array of IPAs that offer up a huge range of happiness. We've all been bitten by a hoppy IPA in our past. Swing by your local Total Wine & More and let our guides find you an IPA that's more YOU. So find what you love and love what you find. Only at Total Wine & More. Cheers!
Thanks to our friends at Total Wine & More for today's A Spirited Debate. David mentioned chaos theory. The one thing about the pardons is they are pristine, singular, outstanding, pretty easy to understand. The whole other half, or, in numbers, other 95% are these flurries of some of them really mind-bending executive orders, but when you put them together as a sort of overall assertion, and of course it's right, like Trump even thought of them. Of course, there was architecture of this that took off from Project 2025. DEI, immigration, border, refugee admissions, plus all kinds of stuff within agencies. I think about DOJ, but the honors program Susan mentioned, withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, stripping antagonists of security clearances again and again and again. Hard to keep track of, and they may just sort of all get mushed up together. But let's start by trying to separate them out. Or what are there individual orders that you're most concerned about, either practically speaking or for the sort of broader constitutional erosion, David, that you were talking about?
I think there are two areas that reflect the themes Donald Trump has often talked about that are fully within, arguably within his power, that should be concerning to us for a couple of reasons. One, from the public health perspective, suspending the public health announcements from HHS, including the weekly morbidity report that has been decades in the making that tells clinicians and practitioners and communities where rising public health issues are. It's the report that allowed us to first start tracking HIV and AIDS. It started to show us that there was the development of COVID. The suspension of HHS's ability to notify the public of public health matters suggests that there is now going to be manipulation, political manipulation of our public health in a way that we saw Donald Trump want to do as he was leaving office and COVID was raging, but he hadn't really had the time to fully do it. And the other is on immigration. It is really hard to escape some of the darker themes of this. Politics is the art of framing. And when you say that there's an undocumented violent criminal who has escaped custody, everybody understands get him and deport him. 90% of the country would agree with that. But to suggest we now are going to go into churches and schools and rip a 6th grade daughter from their dad. Who
Who isn't a violent criminal, by the way. All these people, their crime is not being documented. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Right. But I would point out that some of the harder parts, the darker themes of immigration, and I'll give you one that many people really don't care about, but it's important. Donald Trump this week suspended the refugee resettlement program. And when Republicans say they're against illegal immigration and they want legal immigration to work, the refugee resettlement program is the hallmark of this. It takes 1.5 years, 2 years. It truly requires documentation of fear of persecution or violence. It's not just that you say, oh, I live in a high crime area. It's that your family is a target of persecution on religious grounds or on political grounds. And the people who are vetted for this have been vetted for years. They come into American communities with the assistance of a local organization that helps them find housing and jobs and resettles them into schools and communities. It is one of the most beautiful programs in the United States. It's part of the fabric of the country. When you talk about Emma Lazarus' words, the new Colossus on the Statue of Liberty, bring me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses. This is a program that if Republicans were really just trying to crack down on illegal immigration and trying to support legal immigration, suspending the refugee resettlement program never would have happened. There's also an attack on the asylum program for the same reasons. Bring that all together, bring the attacks on birthright citizenship, and what you see It's hard for millions of Americans to overlook the darker xenophobic themes of the immigration actions this week by Donald Trump. But I think also unsettling to many Americans is how many millions of Americans are cheering this on, who support it. And I think that kind of rips at our culture a little bit and is hard for many of us to recognize within our own country.
I think there are two areas at least where if Trump is at all successful, and I think he could well be, we will be in an almost unrecognizable place in terms of actual public policy or actual governmental structure from where we were going into this administration and from where we've been for decades or century plus, right? One is immigration. And if you put together the pieces of immigration, we're not tinkering. He's stopping programs that he shouldn't stop, and some of them are small, relatively small refugee resettlement. I'm very much for refugee resettlement, don't get me wrong. But the overall changes he's seeking to make in terms of who is admitted, how they're admitted, what due process they might get, the deportation of people who have been here for decades, this is nothing like the fights even of 5-10 years ago, which were pretty nasty and bitter, as David well remembers from Congress. We're back before 1965 and the big Immigration Act. We're back, I don't know quite where we're back to, honestly, 1924 maybe, but I mean, that they cut off the immigration. But that is dark, I think. And I think they have a real plan to get to this place. It's not just throwing stuff at the walls and seeing what sticks. And the combination of some of these executive orders, if it's an invasion, everyone I know, Harry, some of our friends laugh, oh, God, that's not the right way to invoke the invasion. That term means something else. Well, it meant something else before. The President of the United States is using it. He has some ability to define these terms. The Justice Department is now going to, and DHS are going to start issuing regulations based on it. The courts might say, well, we're not in a position to decide. It's kind of let the legislature overrule Trump if they want. I mean, the degree to which immigration policy ends up in a totally different place. And then the way the federal government works. Schedule F, the politicization of the federal government, the monitoring of what people say. It's one thing to say, I don't approve of DEI. Congress didn't mandate a lot of these DEI programs. I'm going to, in an orderly way, re-examine and unravel these programs over the first few months of my administration. And, it'll be done in a sort of reasonable way when you have a new administration. That's not, of course, what's happening. And also, incidentally, they're going after people who are government contractors. A lot of American businesses, government contractors. A lot of American universities and hospitals get government funds. A lot of what they want to do is to go after them, too. So that whole set of relationships, he's not tweaking things. We've had fights before. Should Planned Parenthood be funded, right? I mean, that's the traditional fight. We're way beyond the normal fights about exactly what rules would obtain. And again, I think the whole shock and awe first day part of it is very significant for the signal it sends. That's my final point, which is, why didn't he do the pardon on the first day? Why didn't he say, I'm asking the new Attorney General, once she's confirmed, she probably will be next week, to put together a team. We're going to take a real look at it. He could have done it in a way that would have politically saved him a lot of trouble. Pardon 1,000 of them, 300 get commuted, 100 don't get commuted. He wants to send the signal. This is very much Susan's first point, really. It's him. He gets to do what he wants. He doesn't need to have studies. All these other things, incidentally, could be done in an orderly way. A lot of them could be done. He wants the shock and awe. He wants to shut down. He didn't ask the Attorney General, incoming Attorney General, who you might think would have an opinion about this, whether she wants to change some of the recruitment programs at the Department of Justice, whether she thinks it's important to move some of these people around who have been in senior positions. It happened on day one with a sort of temporary, very temporary, low-ranking acting person in as Attorney General to show he's in charge, which really means his personal aides in the White House and from outside the White House who've already vetted all this stuff are in charge. Incidentally, I worked in a cabinet agency. What do you feel if you're a cabinet secretary? You haven't been confirmed yet, and your whole agency is being reshuffled and redone, and policies and programs are being implemented, and no one asked you? He could have done it, some of it, in an orderly way. He wants not to do it in an orderly way.
Yeah, I think that, we're talking about what's going to last, and having a president who has this view of the supremacy of his own personal actions over all, not just law, but precedent, regular order. We have an entire framework of regulations and civil procedure that govern how the federal executive branch works. And he essentially is, it seems to me, throwing much of that out and daring anyone, whether it's the courts or Congress, to stop him. Along that lines, by the way, as we're having this conversation, I'm looking at an order has gone out from the State Department ordering them to stop work on all existing foreign aid grants, and that includes to Ukraine. And this goes to the point of, he's daring somebody to stop him. Congress appropriated these funds. In fact, it was very hard fought. It took months to get the assistance to Ukraine going again after they politicized it in the middle of the election year in order to help Donald Trump win election. And, they voted on it, they approved it, and he's saying, I don't care. Stop doing all this. This is the level of disruption here is far beyond what we currently understand. It's in the nature of many cataclysmic news events that I've covered before, where the full scale of the natural disaster or military attack, it actually takes a few days even to understand because it's that big. And I think that's what we're looking at here, is that the attack upon the system of American government has been so big in these first few days that we do not yet understand the scale of the natural disaster of, Hurricane Trump, number one. Number two, I wanted to underscore strongly this idea that part of what is only now becoming clear to people, and I hope it does become more clear, is that Donald Trump might have told people that he was campaigning against illegal immigrants, but he and many of his advisors, not all of them, but many of his advisors, including key ones like Stephen Miller, are against legal immigration as well as illegal immigration. That is a radical shift. It's a radical position even in today's Republican Party, number two. And then just the third quick point that I would want to make has to do with, again, it goes back to the aggrandizement of the president in the White House and the unintended consequences that we don't yet know, how it's going to be. But when I look at what's different here from 8 years ago when Trump first came in, I think the handing over of large swaths of the government to the richest men in the world and in a completely untransparent, undisclosed way represents actually a kind of radical shift in our government. The predicate was laid for it by the Supreme Court in their shocking Citizens United decision, the full ramifications of which we're only now understanding 15 years later. But I think that, in fact, we should expect that whereas Elon Musk was an outlier in spending $250 million electing Donald Trump in 2024, when people see the return on that investment and how incredibly successful it was for him, you're going to see amounts of money flowing through our government and levels of corruption that you haven't seen. And by the way, that's how you lose your democracy. That's how you lose your democracy, because then you have entrenched financial interests that have essentially privatized parts of your government and have a huge vested interest in that regime continuing. And so that's what really concerns me a few days in, even though we haven't learned, enough yet about the real nature and contours of their influence over the country.
But the three richest men in the United States, and they seemed almost to be jockeying, Musk started, but you think of Bezos and Zuckerberg like, wow, we got to jump into this pool. I just want to make a couple follow-up points. The first is this is all supplemented and planned with substructures in individual agencies, and the people are coming in with a very strong mindset that this is the deep state. People are going to be resisting us, and we are going to hammer them. And we are perilously close, I think, to the what we think of as the worst of an authoritarian regime, say in Eastern Europe. I'll take your DEI example, but some of the orders already are, encouraging people. You make a stray comment in the hall and it's going to go up somewhere to the enforcer. I mean, it's really a matter of like, can I express my views? And man, if that takes hold, we are so fucked. And then second, I was just really struck, your point about his wanting it, that the imagery here, I've been thinking, wow, they're going to do this immigration stuff and we're going to have like Tiananmen Square or Elian Gonzalez kind of indelible images, shameful to America. He wants them. He wants those things to happen. It's stunning. we're close to the end of time. Bill had said he saw some encouraging things, discouraging. We've been on the discouraging side. I am generally in the Susan camp just because I think the most value that some of us can give is just explain the dangers here. All of us, I think, would say, we're not ready to leave the greatest country on earth in history yet, but it's damn serious. So much more to come. We only have a minute left, so we move to our final feature of Talking 5. So, at the Liberty inaugural ball, Trump and Melania shared their first dance to Frank Sinatra's My Way. Photographs from this event show the couple in close embrace with Melania whispering into her husband's ear. What did Melania say? 5 words or fewer.
Well, it has to be this, and I'm only jumping in because I'm terrified that everybody has the same answer, but it's clearly these exact 5 words. I don't care, do you?
I like the idea for saying, get rid of the immigrants.
Oh, gosh.
unless they're married to Donald Trump, I guess,
Right.
Harry, I would say it was Sinatra, right? My Way?
Yeah, My Way, right.
All right, so I'll play on that. I'd say she said, fly me to the moon.
There you go. And I'm going with, so you'll shred the prenup. Thank you so much, Bill, Susan, and David. And thank you very much, listeners, for tuning in to Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts, and please take a moment to rate and review this podcast. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we are posting full episodes, talking books, and bonus video content. Like the conversation we've just posted with CNN anchor Allison Camerata and the first preview of her new video podcast, Sanity. And speaking of Substack, Talking Feds is now on Substack. Check us out at Talking Feds Substack, where I've been posting 2 or 3 bulletins a week, trying to break down the various threats to constitutional norms and the rule of law. You can follow us on Twitter at Talking Feds Pod, and you can look to see our latest offerings on Patreon. Talking Feds is a completely independent production, always has been. So if you like the work we do and are inclined to support the show, joining our Patreon is the best way to do it. And speaking of Patreon, exciting news, I'm a founding contributor for The Contrarian, which you've probably heard about, and features a really formidable few dozen commentators in all kinds of subject matters, but with a common theme of trying to sound the alarm to Trump's attacks on constitutional rule and the rule of law. It's sort of a one-stop shop for democracy. And as of this week, when you become a paying subscriber to The Contrarian, you will receive almost free a Patreon subscription to Talking Feds. It's almost free because Patreon wouldn't let us give it away completely for free, but it's $1 a month, $1 a month. What could be bad? So go check out The Contrarian, and while you're there, join Talking Feds Patreon for $1 a month. Thanks for tuning in, and don't worry, as long as you need answers, the Feds will keep talking. Talking Feds is produced by Catherine Devine. Our associate producer is Becca Havian. Sound engineering by Matt McArdle. Rosie Dawn Griffin, David Lieberman, Hamza Madrenathan, Emma Maynard, and Hallie Necker are our contributing writers. Production assistance by Akshaj Turbailu, Genesis Magpayo, and Sebastian Navarro. And our music, as ever, is by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.